Nearly 20 years ago, I had the honour of delivering a Bristolian lecture in which I discussed English Freemasonry in the middle of the 19th century. It was a period that saw bitter clashes between the Grand Master and some younger Masons who felt that the central administration was too much a law unto itself. This might also be linked with the growing general spirit of forthright independence of thought amongst the rising mercantile and professional classes of the time. There were clashes over the way in which the Grand Master chose provincial Grand Masters, and there were clashes between many provincial Grand Lodges and their provincial Grand Masters over the way that some of them ignored the province over which they theoretically presided. All this was played out not only in Grand Lodge, but also in the columns of the Masonic press, at a time when the Masonic press was much more influential than today. The consequences of these disputes went deep, and though the result was a partial victory for the rebels, on some issues there were no solutions. Even the appointment of the Prince of Wales as Grand Master left many of the issues hanging in the air. Perhaps the social prestige of the Prince had a massive effect on the willingness of Masons to pursue controversial arguments. His political power may have been negligible, but his social influence was enormous. The influence of Marlborough House and its set cannot be overestimated here, especially as that group and certain other members of the royal family who were beginning to achieve a certain type of revered status in society were so often prominent Masons. The membership would no longer challenge the Grand Master, not because he was Grand Master, but because he was a very senior member of the royal family. The basic problem had been a discordance between Grand Lodge at the centre and provincials who felt the Grand Lodge in London attracted too much of the attention of English Masonry. They felt that London behaved as if the provinces were milch cows set up for the benefit of London interests. At stake were such issues as whether provincial Grand Masters had been appointed for life and how far they had to pay attention to the wishes of their provincial Grand Lodge. The meetings of Grand Lodge were tumultuous, with the Grand Master's supporters striving every muscle to undermine the opposition. However, as time has gone on, it has become rarer for battles to be fought out at meetings of Grand Lodge. Rather, they've been fought behind the scenes, just as bitterly as in the past perhaps, but rarely in public. Perhaps one of the last of such open battles was over the future of the Masonic Hospital, where one of the issues involved resentment from many Freemasons in the provinces that their subscriptions were being used largely for the benefit of Freemasons in London. However, I think it's fair to say that the debate about provincial versus central power has been stifled by the disappearance of platforms for it to be held. There are no longer the likes of the Freemason to host a dialogue. We only have our UGLE house magazine, Freemasonry Today. Another aspect is the virtual disappearance from the London scene of the so-called county lodges. The lodges based in London that attract as members the leading members of that county who had also strong business and political links with London. The Cornish Lodge in London, for example, contained all the powerful financial and Masonic interests in Cornwall and had great sway over the provincial Grand Lodge, but it also had good connections to Grand Lodge itself. Another factor must be the extent to which the Grand Master took an active part in the governance of the United Grand Lodge. The Grand Masters who served between the Duke of Sussex and the Prince of Wales, Zetland and Ripon, had been very much hands-on in their approach to Freemasonry. However, it was well known that the Prince of Wales did not want to be bothered by the details of administration. Inevitably then, the President of the Board of General Purposes, always a significant officer in the craft, became more important, and the board itself took over the policy-making role. Certainly, the list of those who held that office after 1874 shows a wealth of experience and ability. If it is true that in practical terms, the eventual result has been to strengthen the power of the central administration in Great Queen Street, Then the question I would ask is, how could that have come about? Some words from the program master a couple of years ago, made at one of the quarterly communications, are perhaps relevant. I quote, "At home, we have had 28 changes of provincial or district Grand Masters. The deputy and assistant Grand Masters have been greatly involved. We are enormously encouraged by the caliber and enthusiasm demonstrated by our new rulers. And I'm pleased that we seem to have a strong team of leaders throughout our constitution." Some years ago, provincial Grand Masters suggested that the rulers got even more involved in the appointment of their successors. This rather surprised us, as we felt it could be seen as unwelcome interference. However, we are encouraged to think about the qualities that a good ruler in the craft might possess and how this might manifest in the success of their province. As a result, the whole system is now more robust and we are seeing the benefits. I believe the sharing of the burden of decisions has been welcomed and the craft is benefiting as a result. Or again, believe it or not, brethren, in addition to selecting those we think will do the best job, we now actually tell our provincial and district Grand Masters what is required of them. About 3 times a year, we run courses for future and new provincial and district Grand Masters. And in September 2019, the Grand Secretary said at a quarterly communication, UGLE has traditionally been a federal amalgamation of city-states, each ruled by a provincial or district Grand Master, whose patents were granted by the most worshipful Grand Master. It was not uncommon in decades past for those chosen few to be given their patent and told, get on with it, but very little instruction or guidance as to what it entailed. We like to think that we are more enlightened now and take some time and effort to explain what we think a provincial or district ruler might want to consider. For anyone who has spent time studying Freemasonry during its first 150 years, these remarks are truly revolutionary. Let me take a matter of statistics. Whereas the number of provinces in England and Wales has barely changed since the middle of the 19th century, the number of lodges has very much increased. Their importance is clear, even if merely in terms of their number. In 1851, there were 613 provincial lodges. In 1900, there were 1,354. 30 years later, they had virtually doubled in number to 2,599. But in 1951, following World War II, their number had risen to over 4,000. At their peak in 1991, there were nearly 6,000 lodges in the provinces. As recently as 2007, there were 1,489 London lodges and 5,996 provincial lodges, while in 2016, there were 1,274 London lodges, showing a decline of 215, and 5,376 in the provinces, a decline of 620. The decades during the Prince of Wales being Grand Master has seen an explosion in numbers, and there were some similarly significant increases following the 2 world wars. But even if we recognize that in recent years there's been falling off of numbers of individual Freemasons and in the numbers of lodges, there can be no doubt that Grand Lodge would not be able to cope with the administration of the craft without the assistance of a strong structure linking London with the provinces. Then as now, the key to that link rests with the various provincial Grand Masters. When the first provincial Grand Masters began to appear, as in 1738, in the 2nd edition of Anderson's Constitutions, they did so following approaches made by some lodges in the provinces for recognition by what had originally been the Grand Lodge of London and Westminster. Cheshire was the first to have its locally elected leader, But with the growth of the number of lodges in the provinces and overseas, the number of such deputations of authority by the Grand Master increased. Such disciplined deputations were granted in 1727 to individuals in Wales. Then deputations were requested from and sent to 4 counties in England. And there's a record of 16 names of various ad hoc appointments at different times for areas in Central Europe, especially Hamburg and Hanover, as well as one for East India, where nobody is to be found, it said, and similar appointments for Africa and North America. Such officers were often appointed without there being any definite plan about their powers. Clearly, they represented the Grand Master in areas considered to be too far distant from London for Grand Lodge to be able to exert any effective authority. However, within a generation, the rank of Provincial Grand Master was being given to individuals where there were no local lodges for them to manage. In effect, to give such individuals a status within Grand Lodge and Freemasonry as a whole. Typical of several others was the Provincial Grand Master in Yorkshire, who, when he was asked to resign because he had never done any work in that office, replied he did so willingly. Had he known that there was any work associated with the appointment, he would never have taken it on in the first place. Parallel to that was often a strong desire locally for an effective Provincial Grand Master, shown in frequent complaints from the provinces that their Provincial Grand Master was neglecting them, or that their Provincial Grand Master had died and no successor had been appointed. However, after the appointment of Thomas Dunkley in 1767 as a Provincial Grand Master, he transformed the office and the range of its possible activities. At one stage, he was even described as a Provincial Grand Master of England. While that was not exactly true, at one time or another, and often at the same time, he was the Superintendent or Provincial Grand Master of Hampshire in 1767, Isle of Wight 1772, Essex 1776, Dorset 1777, Wiltshire 1777, Gloucestershire 1784, Somerset 1784, City and County of Bristol 1786, and Herefordshire 1790. Eventually, he was to be Provincial Grand Master of no fewer than 9 provinces, as well as Superintendent of 12 provinces in the Holy Royal Arch. Dunkley did most to promote the image of a Provincial Grand Master, not only in his relations with Grand Lodges in London, but with the various lodges that came under his jurisdiction. He was extremely active, both in giving a real structure to his provinces and in going out of his way to attract many of the gentry at a local level. His work in collecting and remitting large sums of money for the charity and hall funds was particularly important. He visited individual lodges and provinces, widely to publicize and encourage new members. He wrote, for example, "I have in the course of this year held Grand Lodges at Colchester, Blandford and Bristol. I was favoured with the attendance of near 200 brethren on His Majesty's birthday, in procession to the Church of Wells. He argued for the creation of further new provinces. It will enable me to appoint a great number of blue and red aprons, which I find a great advantage to society, as it attracts the notice of the principal gentlemen in the various counties, whom seem ambitious to attend me at my provincial Grand Lodges." Clearly then, Thomas Dunkley had been anxious to extend the range of his Freemasonry and its appeal to a wide range of possible members. What sort of person was appointed as Provincial Grand Master? Usually, attempts were made, both by the Grand Master and by local Freemasons, to secure the appointment of a notable local landowner. A survey of 38 provinces at the time of the Union of 1813 suggests that 11 Provincial Grand Masters were peers, 10 titled gentlemen, usually baronets, 6 naval or army officers, then the social origins of 8 of them were obscure. This emphasis on a nobleman or a landed man continued throughout the century. In 1860, one past Provincial Grand Master for Kent, an eminent QC by profession, wrote, "My appointment would not have been thought of had there been a nobleman or gentleman having estates in the province and settled there, willing to undertake the office." In 1870, there were in place 38 craft Provincial Grand Masters. 17 of them were peers, 5 were baronets, 3 were untitled members of Parliament, 2 were reverends, 2 were army officers, and 9 were untitled gentry. That was the year that the gentry and Freemasons of Leicestershire forced William Kelly on the Grand Master as Provincial Grand Master for Leicestershire and Rutland. Kelly had served as Deputy Provincial Grand Master for over 20 years, despite his comparatively lowly status as borough accountant. But he wrote of himself, "My social position was not high enough to fit me to be the Grand Master of the province. The head of Masonry in the province should be a man in a far higher social position as regards wealth and rank than myself." There was, however, in the province, a very strong feeling of support for him, and one local Mason wrote of a possible alternative title candidate, "I have not a word to say against Lord Ferrers personally. He is quite unknown to us. But I do say that if Lord Howard can't be induced to remain and Brother Kelly to continue to act under him, Brother Kelly ought to be our Provincial Grand Master. We don't want a boy pitchforked over us." The Grand Master objected very strongly about this, but when Kelly was eventually appointed, the Grand Secretary wrote to Kelly, "The Grand Master is convinced that should it hereafter appear desirable for the benefit of the province to appoint Earl Ferrers or any other nobleman to the office, you are too good a Mason to stand in the way some years hence." Within 3 years, Kelly had surrendered that office to a peer, although he retained all his other Masonic officers. Though this attitude to Grand Lodge was still prevalent a generation later, is illustrated by the remark in 1912 of Lord Ampthill, the Pro-Grand Master, that it was, quote, "advantageous to the craft that its conspicuous situation should be filled by those who enjoy the external ranks of advantages of rank and fortune." In that year, out of 43 Provincial Grand Masters, 26 were peers. 9 were retired army officers, 6 were landed gentry, and 2 were clergymen. Many still served for life, and certainly for very long periods of time. A similar analysis of Provincial Grand Masters in 1969 shows that out of 42 Provincial Grand Masters then in post, 17 can be identified as being ex-military, 13 as members of the nobility. And one senior member of the staff at Great Queen Street recalled quite recently that the desire to have a local peer or magnate to preside over a province, no matter how active or experienced he was in Freemasonry, with a strong deputy actually running the province, was still prevalent when I joined the staff here in 1971. A rapid analysis of various provincial websites would suggest that at present, 29 Provincial Grand Masters can be identified as professional, and that none of them can be identified as substantial landowners. If we move from the Provincial Grand Master in general to specific provinces, I can point to 2 very significant examples. Out of 17 Devonshire PGMs since the late 18th century, 3 have been peers, 2 were titled gentry, 2 were clergymen, 1 was ex-military, 4 were businessmen, 3 were professionals such as solicitor, school teacher, or chartered engineer, 1 a farmer, and 1 unknown. Of the last 8 to hold this office, it's been remarked that there have been essentially very worthy but ordinary members of the Devon community, not in any way part of the Devon establishment county set. Very limited local political connections by comparison with the pre-Second World War period. I looked also at Leicestershire. Out of its first 7 provincial Grand Masters, 6 were titled, 4 being peers. One of the 7 was William Kelly, who we have already discussed. But after death of Kelly's titled successor, the position was held at first by the local chief constable of very plebeian origins, then by representatives of the wholesale boot and shoe trade and hosiery manufacturing industries, by an ex-military yarn merchant, and latterly by representatives of various professions such as quantity surveyor or solicitor. And while the earlier appointments have been for life, the more recent ones have always been for a specific number of years. From almost the beginning of the existence of the office of Provincial Grand Masters, there have been deputies, appointed by the Provincial Grand Master, and on many occasions recognized as having performed many of the duties that normally fell to the Provincial Grand Master himself. However, Grand Lodge gave no recognition to the rank. In 1857, a motion was proposed at Grand Lodge that all deputy provincial Grand Masters be entitled to appear in Grand Lodge in the clothing of their office and to take their seats upon the dais. In support, the proposer set forth the great services rendered to the craft by this valuable class of officers. The acting Grand Master opposed it, saying it could not be carried out unless the Grand Master had the power of appointing the Deputy Provincial Grand Master, as well as the Provincial Grand Masters themselves. A study of Provincial Grand Masters and of Deputy Provincial Grand Masters shows a highly variable pattern. In some provinces, the Deputy has rarely or never been appointed to the higher office, although more recently it has become much more common for the deputy to receive that appointment. What stands out in Leicestershire is that since 1851, with only 2 exceptions, all its installed Provincial Grand Masters had previously served as Deputy Provincial Grand Master. To sum up, in the past, Provincial Grand Masters have been recruited from the leading social and economic figures in the province, and that usually meant members of the local landed aristocracy. With the decline of the power and influence of the aristocracy, a change has gradually come over the groups regarded as forming the local establishment. It might be argued that perhaps the new 21st century regional establishment has not yet properly emerged. Who, it might be asked, are the obvious makers and shakers in the provinces at the present time? And if power and authority do not derive from a position of local strength, that implies that it has come even more strongly from the centre. Another issue has been of considerable importance and of considerable controversy has been the position of Provincial Grand Lodge. If the office of Provincial Grand Master tended to be rather vague in origins, authority, and even in usefulness, the approach to Provincial Grand Lodge was even vaguer. There were arguments about whether Provincial Grand Officers had any independent existence. Even when they were recognized as having local status, there were arguments about the regalia to be worn by the officers. In some provinces, the most senior, perhaps the only, craft lodge arrogated to itself the title and status of a Provincial Grand Lodge. And on occasion, when there was a vacancy of Provincial Grand Master, the master of that lodge would claim to be able to act in that capacity. It was not until 1815 that a regulation was made that the powers and existence of a Provincial Grand Lodge depended upon the Provincial Grand Master, when the Book of Constitutions declared, "No Provincial Grand Lodge can meet but by the sanction of the Provincial Grand Master or his deputy," and that it ceases to exist on the death, resignation, suspension, or removal of Provincial Grand Master until he be reinstated or a successor appointed, by whose authority they may again be regularly convened. Provincial Grand Masters were also enjoined to hold meetings of their Provincial Grand Lodge at least once a year, but that was often neglected. There were regular complaints of a failure by provincial Grand Masters to consult the leading Masons in the province. Correspondence in the archives of Grand Lodge shows that even after the constitutions had mandated the holding of regular meetings of a provincial Grand Lodge, there were many complaints from all over the country that provincial Grand Lodges had not been summoned for a number of years. Even when provincial Grand Lodges had been constituted and appointments made to various provincial Grand officers, there were complaints that the appointments had gone to persons who were either unsuitable or even unqualified for any appointment. If I may again be allowed to take Leicestershire as an example, its first provincial Grand Masters were appointed by the Moderns Grand Master at a time when there were no Moderns lodges in the province. And even after such a lodge was eventually founded, the new provincial Grand Master, Lord Radcliffe, only appeared in the province on one occasion. That Moderns Lodge, St. John's, was most concerned over Radcliffe's inactivity. It declared that it was the provincial Grand Lodge of Leicestershire, and on Radcliffe's death, it decided to take an initiative to fill the vacancy. But despite making many appeals to the Grand Master, it was only after a gap of some 12 years that Radcliffe's son was nominated to fill the vacancy. The Lodge then tried to persuade the new provincial Grand Master to appoint a deputy and to fill the other provincial officers. Radcliffe continued to ignore his province. And it was not until 1833 that he was forced to make such appointments. The Grand Master, the Duke of Sussex, was visiting a friend in Nottingham. The various neighbouring provincial Grand Masters attended to pay their respects to the Duke, who invited them to present to him their leading provincial officers. Radcliffe had hastily to withdraw to a side room, gather together various members of St. John's Lodge, appoint them to provincial office, and then present them to the Duke. Another outstanding complaint concerned the province of Sussex and its Grand Master, the Duke of Richmond. The fourth Duke of Richmond had been provincial Grand Master from 1814 until his death in Canada in 1890. But the post was left vacant until 1823, when his son, the fifth Duke, was appointed to it. He, in turn, was not exactly known for his attention to Masonic business, so that in 1830, one lodge in Brighton held an emergency meeting for the purpose of writing to His Grace the Duke of Richmond on the propriety of calling a provincial Grand Lodge. Nothing happened. In 1852, another Sussex lodge wrote to him, "To address your Grace on the position of the craft in this province, owing to the non-organization of a provincial Grand Lodge. The last provincial Grand Lodge was convened in the year 1827, 24 years earlier, since which period the craft had been comparatively without a deputy provincial Grand Master or provincial Grand Secretary with whom to communicate on Masonic matters. We have abstained from appealing to the Grand Lodge on the state to which our provincial lodge has for many years been placed, out of grateful respect to your Grace as its Grand Master, and in the confident hope that now your attention has been drawn to the subject, your Grace will be pleased forthwith to adopt such a course as will lead to the appointment of an influential and competent Deputy Grand Master, who will, under your Grace's supervision, appoint the Secretary, Wardens, Chaplains, and other officers, so that a provincial Grand Lodge may be convened at a very early period." Arguments over the place of provincial Grand Lodges were extremely bitter, and were not helped by the intervention of the two leading Masonic newspapers, the Freemasons Magazine and the Masonic Observer. They were especially vituperative. Quote, "We hope also the provincial Grand Masters in the province or the deputies, for in many cases the Grand Masters are merely ornamental appendages to the order, serving by high-sounding titles to give a false gloss to the position of Masonry in the province, will be careful not only to learn their own duties, but to appoint no brother to office whom they are not fully convinced to do the same. It is only a few months since we were present at a Provincial Grand Lodge, at which the Right Worshipful Provincial Grand Master, a brother of the highest standing in life, and one who is universally revered in the district in which he lives, and nearly all, if not every one of his officers, read their parts, which were written for them on half sheets of foolscap. Now this should not be, for there is nothing in the opening or closing of any lodge, be it private or grand, which any man of ordinary intelligence, and none other should be admitted into Freemasonry, ought not to be able to commit to memory within an hour. Many men would do so in 10 minutes. The extreme case was that of the linked provinces of Berkshire and Buckinghamshire. The same individual, as Provincial Grand Master, held these two provinces, though they were always kept independent and separate. In 1847, the Marquis of Devonshire had been appointed, but over the next 14 years, he held only 5 meetings in the Provincial Grand Lodge. Our letter appeared in the Freemason magazine. Can any of you or your readers tell us how it is that we have had no meeting of the Provincial Grand Lodge of the Royal County of Berks for, I believe, the last 6 years? The sound of the Provincial Grand Master's gavel is heard in almost every county, and in the distant outposts of Masonry, with great regularity, and is hailed with joy by the brethren who obey it. But we have been listening and waiting for that summons year after year in vain. No doubt to be entertained of the benefits and necessity of a Provincial Grand Lodge. Why then does it exist with us in name only? It was partly as a result of the state of this double province. The first decisive steps to bring order to the provinces were taken by Grand Lodge, which in February 1857 passed a resolution directing the Grand Secretary, quote, to procure a return of the number of Provincial Grand Lodges held in each province in the past 10 years, specifying those at which the Provincial Grand Master has resided in person, and to return the same to Grand Lodge. The return is of great interest, and the Provincial Grand Masters come out of it with mixed reputations. Not surprisingly, the twin provinces of Berks and Berks did not make any return at all. When pressed by the Grand Master why no return had been made, the notable Marquis commented he could not say when the last meeting had been held, since no one could find the minute book. The Grand Master added the statement that he himself had written to brother the Marquis of Downshire on this subject, but not yet received an answer. But as the noble Marquis was absent on the continent, he might not have received communication. The continuing importance of the provincial structure is best indicated through the finances of the craft. In the middle of the 19th century, the demands from the then 2 Masonic charities were putting a strain upon the finances of the Grand Lodge, and there were complaints that individual members of the craft were failing to give them adequate support. There were complaints too that some lodges were receiving benefits that their contributions did not merit. Grand Lodge called for an inquiry that recognized that the only answer to these continuing problems was by harnessing provincial endeavors and setting up a structure to raise money on a regular provincial rather than an individual lodge level. It became clear that each province had to establish a formal local charitable organization feeding into the national structure. The provinces became vital for the continuing well-being of Freemasonry. Apart from the amounts of money contributed as fees, etc., an important feature of Masonic life became the regular appeals for contributions to provincial festivals that continue to be a feature of every province's life. There is a further factor in considering the balance of power between London, Provincial Grand Masters, and individual members of the craft. Some years ago, in the transactions of Crata Coronati Lodge, they discussed the appointments to past grand rank of individuals who had never been active Grand Lodge officers. It pointed out that one consequence was a considerable change in the numbers attending meetings at Grand Lodge and the ways in which this changed the nature of those meetings. So far as I am aware, there's been no study of the comparable development of past rank appointments in Provincial Grand Lodge, but the net result must be having had the same effect. Certainly, the annual meeting of Provincial Grand Lodge is in effect an award ceremony. So the Provincial Grand Masters have to turn to other bodies, such as lodges of installed masters, in order to ascertain the feelings of members of the craft. And perhaps we may see developments in the provinces of a trend already discussed in relation to Grand Lodge itself. That as Provincial Grand Lodge becomes an increasingly ceremonial body, the Provincial Committee of General Purposes becomes a forum for the making of local policy. I return to the remarks that I quoted at the beginning of this lecture. On the face of it, the balance of power as between Grand Lodge and the provinces has swung in favor of the organization based on Great Queen Street. There is no longer even a forum in which strongly felt dissensions could openly be expressed. Provincial Grand Masters, always appointed by Great Queen Street, have come more directly within the administrative machine. The parallel drawn by the Grand Secretary between the Italian city-states and the individual provinces was a very real one, and it is significant that they were eventually succeeded by a very much more unified equivalent of the nation-state. Are we seeing a series of steps by which Great Queen Street is taking over more and more of the functions previously exercised locally? I was recently approached by a leading Freemason, not in this province, who suggested that a move to standardized lodge bylaws and directives concerning the use and maintenance of provincial Freemasons' halls represented precisely that element of encroachment upon local independence. There is a parallel to this process of centralization and Freemasonry. Over many generations, England had developed a structure of local autonomy in government, economics, and social welfare, working through the local landed gentry and their appointments as justices of the peace. This structure was weakened during the second half of the 19th century, partly through a population explosion and partly through a severe erosion of the economic structure of the landed interest. Legislation by central government opened up local government to new wealth and new social classes. Elected county councils took over many of the functions previously controlled by the Justice of the Peace. In their turn, these councils came under increasing control from central government, operating often through its control over local authority finance. That has led to a deep current political debate about localism and regional devolution, and that might well reflect our own debates about the structure of Freemasonry. I suggest that the parallel is clear. I've made the point. The UGLA has increasingly been seeking to micromanage not only provinces, but also through Provincial Grand Masters, individual lodges by a series of initiatives such as the Pathway. Increasingly, the acceptable face of Masonry is becoming that of a charitable fundraising body doing much good within society. The issue is whether the result has resulted in a stronger structure than in the past, whether Freemasonry is now better equipped to meet future challenges and maintain its position in society. Currently, Freemasonry remains dependent on the individual Freemason, on his willingness to continue his membership and provide financial support. Just as it was 300 years ago, so it is now. The recruitment and retention of each individual Freemason, supporting his lodge and Freemasonry's financial commitments, remains basic to the future of the craft. Essentially, the future of the craft depends on the individual finding his own place in the craft structure and above all, finding enjoyment in his continuing membership. No historian has a crystal ball, and certainly this historian has no way of foreseeing the future. All he can do is to point to the past and invite the audience to draw his own conclusions from his interpretation. Thank you very much.